Before he ever corrected a pope, before emperors trembled at his words, Peter Damian was a neglected and mistreated child, orphaned and nearly broken by poverty, sold into hardship, starved of affection, and formed in suffering. He learned early that the world could be cruel, but that God was unshakable. From that wounded beginning rose a monk of iron will and blazing purity, a man who would confront corruption at the highest levels of the church and demand reform when few dare to speak. His life is the astonishing journey of a forgotten boy who became the conscience of Christendom. Peter Damian was born around 1007 in Ravenna, a city that had once been the jewel of the Western Roman Empire, but now languished in the chaos of medieval Italy. His parents, though their names are lost to history, appear to have been of modest means, not destitute, but certainly not wealthy. The family already had many children, and Peter's arrival was not greeted with joy. His mother, worn down by poverty and repeated childbirth, looked upon this infant with something close to despair. According to Peter's own later writings, she even considered abandoning him, refusing to nurse the child who represented yet another mouth she could barely feed. It was a neighboring woman, moved by compassion, who intervened. She reproached Peter's mother with words that cut through her desperation. "Why do you wish to kill what God has made?" Whether shamed or genuinely moved, Peter's mother relented and nursed the child. But her heart, it seems, never fully warmed to him. The boy who would later write so eloquently about divine love and mercy knew from his first breath the cold sting of rejection. Then came the catastrophe that would define his childhood. While Peter was still very young, some sources suggest around 5 or 6 years old, both his parents died. In medieval Italy, this was a death sentence of another kind. Orphans without substantial inheritance were at the mercy of relatives who often viewed them as burdens rather than blessings. Peter and his siblings were divided among family members, and young Peter fell into the hands of an older brother whose name has mercifully been forgotten by history, but whose cruelty is not. This brother was married to a woman whose heart seemed made of stone. They put Peter to work as a swineherd, the lowliest of occupations, one reserved for the most worthless members of society. Each morning, the small boy would drive the pigs to forage, watching over them as they rooted in the mud. At night, he slept among them, their warmth his only comfort against the cold. The life of a swineherd was considered so degrading that in many medieval tales, it represented the absolute nadir of human existence. Recall the prodigal son, who knew he had reached bottom when he longed to eat the pods the pigs were eating. But worse than the degradation was the abuse. Peter's sister-in-law beat him regularly, finding fault with everything he did. Too slow in his work? A beating. Pigs wandered too far? A beating. The boy learned to move through the world in a constant state of fearful vigilance, never knowing when the next blow would fall. He was given barely enough food to survive, often going hungry while watching others eat. His clothes were rags. He had no shoes. In winter, his feet would crack and bleed from the cold. Yet something in Peter refused to break. Perhaps it was the ember of his mother's grudging love, kept alive by that neighbor woman's intervention. Perhaps it was something deeper, planted by God in his soul from the beginning. He began to pray. Simple prayers at first, the desperate pleas of a child in pain. But gradually, as months turned to years, these prayers became more than mere cries for help. They became conversation, communion, a lifeline to something beyond a pigsty and the beatings and the gnawing hunger. In later life, Peter would write about the school of affliction where God teaches his chosen ones. He wrote with the authority of experience, not theory. Those years of suffering were not wasted. They were a crucible. The boy learned humility not from books, but from sleeping with pigs. He learned compassion not from sermons, but from being shown none. And he learned that when all earthly comfort is stripped away, God remains. Then, like a shaft of light breaking through storm clouds, came salvation in an unexpected form. Another brother, His name was Damian, learned of Peter's situation, and was horrified. Unlike the cruel brother, Damian was a man of genuine piety and means, an archpriest who had achieved some position in the church. He went immediately to rescue his youngest brother, and the contrast between his arrival and Peter's daily reality must have seemed like a miracle. Damian did not merely take Peter in. He adopted him completely. He clothed him, fed him, and most remarkably, he saw in this ragged, half-starved child a spark of intelligence worth nurturing. Where others had seen only a worthless mouth to feed, Damian saw potential. He determined that Peter would be educated, that he would have every opportunity Damian could provide. The gratitude Peter felt was so profound that he took Damian's name as his own, becoming Peter Damian. Peter of Damian, a living testament to the brother who had saved him. This was not common practice, but it spoke to the depth of Peter's love and debt. He would carry that name for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the moment when mercy broke through suffering. Damian sent Peter to school in Faenza, and then to Parma, cities where the young man could receive the best education available in northern Italy. And Peter proved to be brilliant. The mind that had been exercised in survival now turned to learning with ferocious intensity. He mastered Latin and rhetoric with ease. He studied the liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He read the church fathers and the classical authors. His teachers marveled at his quickness, his memory, his ability to grasp complex ideas and express them with clarity and force. But education brought new temptations. As Peter grew into young manhood, handsome and gifted, the world opened before him like a flower. He was no longer the ragged swineherd, but a promising scholar, a young man with prospects. He began to teach, and his reputation grew. Students flocked to hear him. His lectures were brilliant, his arguments devastating. He could become wealthy, respected, powerful in the academic world of his day. And he wanted it. Peter later confessed that during this period, he was drawn to worldly success with the same intensity he would later bring to spiritual pursuits. He enjoyed the admiration of students, the respect of colleagues, the promise of advancement. He dressed well, ate well, lived well. The memory of the pigsty faded, and with it, perhaps, some of the prayers that had sustained him there. Yet even in the midst of this worldly success, something gnawed at him. He would later write a feeling of profound unease, a sense that despite his achievements, he was building on sand. The sermons he heard in church began to penetrate his defenses. He read accounts of the Desert Fathers, those early Christian monks who had fled to the wilderness to seek God with undivided hearts. Their radical commitment made his own life seem shallow, a charade of importance covering an emptiness he was afraid to acknowledge. The turning point came gradually, then suddenly, as such things often do. Peter began to notice the monks of Font Avellana, a hermitage in the Apennine Mountains about 50 miles from where he taught. These were not ordinary monks living in comfortable monasteries. They were hermits following the ancient rule of St. Romuald, living in individual cells, meeting only for prayer, embracing a life of extraordinary austerity. They fasted constantly, slept on boards, wore rough hair shirts, and spent their days in prayer and manual labor. Most people viewed them as fanatics, extremists who had taken religious devotion too far. But Peter was drawn to them with an attraction he could not explain or resist. He began to visit Font Avellana, at first perhaps out of curiosity, then with increasing frequency. He would watch the monks at prayer, their faces transformed by an intensity he had never seen in the comfortable churches of the cities. They had something he lacked, something his success and learning could not provide. One of the hermits, sensing Peter's hunger, spoke to him plainly. You can fill your life with honors and possessions, but in the end, you will stand before God alone, without your books, without your students, without your fine clothes. What will you say to him then? The question haunted Peter. He returned to his teaching, but the words echoed in his mind during every lecture. He looked at his students with new eyes and saw how temporary, how fragile, how ultimately meaningless all of this was. Not wrong, necessarily, but insufficient, radically insufficient. Then came the night that changed everything. Peter was alone in his room, unable to sleep, tormented by the growing conviction that he was wasting his life on things that did not matter. He fell to his knees and began to pray, not the polite, formal prayers of a scholar, but the desperate, raw prayers of the child in the pigsty. He wept. He pleaded. He told God he was afraid to give up everything, afraid of the austerity of Font Avellana, afraid of failure, afraid of his own weakness. And in that darkness, in that fear, he felt something break open inside him. It was not a vision or a voice, but a clarity, a certainty that cut through all his doubts like a sword through cloth. He knew, with absolute conviction, that God was calling him to the hermitage, not suggesting, not inviting, calling, demanding, the way a father calls a lost son home. When morning came, Peter Damian, brilliant professor and rising star of medieval academia, made his decision. He would leave everything, his position, his students, his prospects, his comfort, and enter Font Avellana. He was around 28 years old, at the height of his powers and potential. By worldly standards, it was insane. By the standards of eternity, it was the first truly sane thing he had ever done. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. His students begged him to reconsider. But Peter was unmoved. He had spent years building a life on sand, and he had felt it shifting beneath him. Now he would build on rock, no matter how hard and cold that rock might be. He gathered his few possessions, gave away what he could not carry, and walked into mountains toward Font Avellana. As he climbed the steep path toward a hermitage, leaving the cities and schools behind, Peter must have felt the weight of his decision. There would be no going back, no second-guessing, no compromise. The hermit life was absolute, yet with each step, he also must have felt something like relief, even joy. He was finally going home, to a home he had never seen but had always, somehow, known was waiting for him. The boy from the pigsty, the brilliant scholar, the worldly teacher, all these identities were falling away, leaving only the essential thing, a soul desperate for God, willing at last to pay the price of finding him. The great iron door of Font Avellana swung open. Peter Damian stepped through, and the world would never be the same. The cell was 6 feet by 8 feet, with stone walls so cold that frost formed on them in winter. This was Peter's new world, a space barely large enough to lie down in, furnished only with a wooden board for sleeping, a small desk for writing, and a crucifix on the wall. The hermits of Font Avellana each lived in such cells, arranged like a cluster of tombs on the mountainside, connected by covered walkways where wind howled through the gaps. They emerged only for the night office and mass, otherwise remaining in absolute solitude. Most men would have gone mad within a week. Peter Damian stayed for decades, and it was here, in this voluntary prison, that he became truly free. The regime at Font Avellana was brutal by any standard. The hermits rose at midnight for the first of many prayer offices that would structure their day. They fasted constantly, no meat ever, and during Lent only bread and water, and that sparingly. They wore hair shirts against their skin, the coarse fabric rubbing until it drew blood. They slept on wooden boards without mattresses. In winter, they had no heat. In summer, no relief from the sweltering stone cells. And they scourged themselves not occasionally, but regularly, methodically, reciting the entire Psalter while bringing leather whips down on their own backs until the blood ran. Modern readers recoil from such practices, seeing only pathology and self-hatred. But Peter saw something else entirely. For him, the body was not evil but dangerous, a magnificent beast that, left untamed, would drag the soul wherever its appetites led. The question was not whether to discipline the body, but how. Peter had tried the comfortable path, the path of moderation and worldly success, and he had found a hollow. Now he would try the opposite extreme and discover whether the ancient hermits had been fools or prophets. They were prophets. Within months, Peter began to experience what the mystical tradition calls the dark night of the soul, that stripping away of all consolation that precedes genuine union with God. His prayers felt like shouting into a void. He was assaulted by doubts, by memories of his comfortable former life, by temptations both subtle and crude. The demons, it seemed, did not appreciate losing such a promising soul and fought viciously to reclaim him. Peter's response was to double down. When temptation came, he prayed harder, fasted longer, scourged more severely. He began to spend entire nights in prayer, standing with arms outstretched in the form of a cross until his muscles screamed. He wept for his sins, not the actual sins of his relatively blameless life, but the infinite distance between himself and divine perfection that any honest soul must recognize. His fellow hermits could hear him sometimes, crying out in his cell, wrestling with invisible adversaries. Then, gradually, the darkness began to lift, not all at once, but in moments of piercing clarity that grew longer and more frequent during prayer. Peter would sometimes feel himself caught up beyond himself, beyond the cell, beyond even his own thoughts, into a silence so profound it was like standing at the center of creation. He never spoke of these experiences directly. That was not the hermit way. But his writings hint at them, describing moments when the soul passes beyond itself and tastes something of the divine nature that human language cannot capture. One night, in the depths of winter, Peter had an experience that would mark him forever. He was praying the night office alone in his cell when he felt, suddenly and overwhelmingly, the presence of the Virgin Mary. Not a vision. Exactly. He saw nothing unusual with his physical eyes, but he knew, with a certainty beyond mere belief, that she was there, close enough to touch. And she was weeping for the corruption in the church, for the souls being lost, for the shepherds who had become wolves. Peter fell on his face, trembling, and in that moment he received what he later described as a commission. He was to be Mary's voice, her instrument, her sword against the evils destroying her son's church. From that moment, Peter Damian changed. He had been a hermit seeking personal holiness. Now he became a prophet, burning with a message he could not contain. He began to write letters, treatises, sermons, with a ferocity and eloquence that stunned everyone who read them. His Latin was flawless, his logic devastating, his rhetoric like hammer blows. And his target was a corruption that had infected the church from top to bottom. The 11th century church was in crisis. Bishops bought and sold their positions in a practice called simony, named after Simon Magus, who tried to buy spiritual power in the book of Acts. Priests kept concubines openly, fathering children and passing their churches to them like family businesses. Monasteries had become comfortable social clubs for the younger sons of nobility. The liturgy was performed sloppily or not at all. And over it all, the Pope himself was often a puppet of Roman noble families, more concerned with temporal power than spiritual leadership. Peter attacked all of it with the fury of an Old Testament prophet. His treatise Book of Gemara remains one of the most searing denunciations of clerical sexual corruption ever written. He named names, cited specific cases, and demanded consequences. To bishops who lived in luxury while their people starved, he wrote, "You wear purple and fine linen while Christ goes naked and is poor. You feast sumptuously while he hungers. You pile up gold while he dies of neglect." To simoniacal prelates who had bought their offices, he declared their ordinations invalid, their sacraments worthless, their souls damned unless they repented. These were not academic exercises. Peter was calling for revolution, for a complete reform of the church from top to bottom. And what made his voice so powerful was that everyone knew he lived what he preached. This was not some comfortable academic theorizing about virtue. This was a man who slept on boards and wore a hair shirt speaking truth to power. His moral authority was absolute because his life was absolutely consistent with his words. Meanwhile, at Font Avallon itself, Peter's reputation was growing. The other hermits recognized his spiritual gifts and his natural leadership. Around 1043, despite his protests, they elected him prior, the head of the community. He was perhaps 36 years old, still young, and he did not want the position. Leadership meant dealing with practical matters, handling disputes, managing resources, all things that took him away from prayer. But obedience was a hermit virtue, and he accepted the burden. As prior, Peter proved to be both strict and compassionate. He maintained the harsh discipline of Font Avallon without compromise, but he also showed remarkable tenderness toward individual hermits who struggled. When a young monk was tormented by sexual temptation, Peter did not condemn him, but wrote him a letter of extraordinary pastoral sensitivity, explaining how such trials were normal, how to fight them, and how they could become occasions for growth in virtue. When another hermit fell into despair, convinced he was unworthy of God's love, Peter spent hours with him, drawing on his own experience of darkness to guide the man back to light. Under Peter's leadership, Font Avallon flourished. New hermits arrived, drawn by reports of the sanctity and intensity of life there. Peter founded several daughter houses, extending the network of reform-minded hermitages across central Italy. He personally visited these foundations, walking mountain paths that would exhaust men half his age, arriving unannounced to ensure they were maintaining the austere standard he demanded. But it was his writing that extended his influence far beyond the hermitage. His letters circulated widely, copied and recopied, read aloud in monasteries and episcopal courts throughout Italy and beyond. Popes consulted him. Bishops feared him. Reformers revered him. He became the conscience of the church, the voice no one could ignore, because everyone knew he spoke not from ambition or malice, but from genuine, burning love for truth. Then came the summons he had been dreading. Pope Stephen IX, himself a reformer who admired Peter deeply, decided the church needed Peter's voice at the highest levels. In 1057, over Peter's vigorous protests, he literally begged to be left alone. Stephen appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. This was no honorary title. Ostia was a port diocese of Rome, and its bishop had significant responsibilities in papal administration. Peter would have to leave his beloved hermitage and enter the political snake pit of the Roman Curia. Peter was 50 years old, and he wept like a child at the news. He wrote to the Pope in the most passionate terms, begging to be released from this appointment. "I am a monk, not a bishop," he pleaded. "I know nothing of worldly affairs. You are sending a sheep among wolves, and the sheep will be devoured." But Stephen was adamant, and Peter, bound by obedience to the Pope as he had been bound by obedience to his monastic community, finally submitted. The consecration ceremony must have been agony for him. The rich vestments, the elaborate ritual, the crowds, everything Peter had fled to the mountains to escape now surrounded him again. He was installed in the episcopal palace at Ostia, a building of relative comfort and luxury, compared to his cell at Font Avallon. He looked at the fine furnishings with something like horror, and immediately ordered most of them removed, keeping only what was absolutely necessary. He continued to wear his hair shirt under his episcopal robes. He continued to sleep on a board. He continued his regime of fasting and prayer. But he could not escape the responsibilities of his new office. Peter was immediately plunged into the violent politics of the reform movement. The church was divided between reformers, who wanted to purge corruption and assert spiritual independence from secular rulers, and conservatives who benefited from the status quo. Peter became one of the chief voices and agents of reform, traveling throughout Italy on papal missions, confronting bishops and abbots who refused to give up their simoniacal practices or their concubines. These confrontations were often dramatic and dangerous. On one occasion, Peter arrived at a monastery where the abbot lived openly with a woman, and had sold positions to the highest bidders. The abbot, surrounded by armed supporters, refused to even receive Peter. Undaunted, Peter forced his way into the monastery church, climbed into the pulpit, and began to preach. His voice rang out, denouncing the abbot by name, calling him a fornicator and a simoniac, declaring that his abbey had become a brothel and a marketplace rather than a house of God. The abbot's men moved toward the pulpit, hands on their swords. But Peter did not stop. If anything, his voice grew louder, more terrible. He spoke with such authority, such evident conviction, that the armed men hesitated. The monks of the abbey, who had been cowed into silence by their corrupt superior, began to weep. Some fell to their knees. And the abbot, faced with this whirlwind of righteous fury, broke. He fell at Peter's feet, confessed his sins, and begged for mercy. Peter granted it, but only on condition of genuine reform. The concubine was sent away. The simoniacal monks were dismissed. The abbey was restored to proper observance. Such victories were exhausting. Peter longed constantly for Font Avellana, for his cell, for the simplicity of a hermit life. He wrote plaintive letters to successive popes, begging permission to resign his bishopric and return to the mountains. Sometimes they granted temporary leaves, and Peter would rush back to his hermitage like a prisoner granted parole, throwing himself into the austere routine with obvious relief. But then another crisis would erupt, another mission would beckon, and Peter would be summoned back to Rome, back to the exhausting work of reform. Yet through it all, his inner life deepened. The mystical graces he had received at Font Avellana did not cease, but seemed to intensify. Peter developed a particular devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, writing some of the most beautiful Marian poetry and prayers of the medieval period. He experienced visions of saints, particularly Saint Benedict, who appeared to him during times of particular trial to encourage him. He developed an intense awareness of the invisible spiritual battle raging around every soul, seeing demons and angels as clearly as he saw corrupt bishops and faithful monks. In 1072, Peter finally received permission to retire permanently to Font Avellana. He was 65 years old, worn out by decades of travel, conflict, and administrative burdens. He returned to his beloved hermitage like a soldier returning from war, grateful to have survived, eager only for rest. He resumed his place in his tiny cell, took up again the routine of prayer and fasting, and seemed to settle into a peaceful old age. But God had one more mission for him, and it would be his last. The winter of 1072 was bitter in the Apennines, and Peter Damian, now 65 and exhausted from decades of struggle, had finally come home to stay. He settled back into the rhythms of Font Avellana with profound relief. The midnight offices, the long hours of prayer, the blessed solitude of his cell. The fierce battles with corrupt bishops seemed like someone else's life now, a storm he passed through and miraculously survived. His bones ached from years of sleeping on boards. His body bore the scars of countless disciplines, but his soul felt clearer than it had in years. He was home. He would pray, write, guide his beloved hermits, and prepare for death in peace. Or so he thought. Then, in early 1073, a messenger arrived at the hermitage gates, bearing a letter that made Peter's heart sink. It was from Pope Alexander II, and it contained not a request but a command. The city of Ravenna, Peter's birthplace, was embroiled in a crisis that threatened to tear the church apart. The Archbishop of Ravenna, a man named Enrico, had long been at odds with the Pope over questions of authority and jurisdiction. The dispute had now escalated to the point of schism, with Enrico threatening to break entirely from Rome and establish Ravenna as an independent ecclesiastical province. Alexander needed someone who could negotiate with the proud, stubborn archbishop, someone with unquestionable moral authority, someone Ravenna might actually listen to. He needed Peter Damian. Peter read the letter with a mixture of anguish and resignation. He was an old man. The journey to Ravenna in winter would be grueling. He had been given permission to retire, to spend his final years in the peace he had craved for so long. Every fiber of his being wanted to refuse, to stay in his cell, to let someone else handle this impossible mission. But the letter ended with words that made refusal impossible. Do not let the church be torn apart when you might prevent it. I command you in the name of holy obedience. Obedience, the word that had shaped Peter's entire life. He had obeyed when elected prior, though he wanted only solitude. He had obeyed when made bishop, though it felt like exile. He would obey now, though it might kill him. And so, in February 1073, Peter Damian set out from Font Avellana for what would be his final journey. The weather was treacherous. Snow fell heavily in the mountains, and the roads were barely passable. Peter traveled with just a few companions, refusing the comfort of a litter, insisting on walking much of the way despite his age. Those who traveled with him later reported that he seemed driven by an urgency they couldn't quite understand, as if he knew his time was short and was racing against an invisible deadline. He prayed constantly as he walked, his lips moving in the endless recitation of psalms that had become his breath, his heartbeat. As they descended from the mountains toward Ravenna, Peter must have felt the weight of memory. He was returning to the city where he had been born, where his mother had nearly abandoned him, where he had been orphaned and enslaved to his cruel brother. How much had changed! The ragged swineherd was now a cardinal, a reformer whose name was known throughout Christendom, a man whose words made bishops tremble and popes listen. Yet he was still, somehow, that frightened child, still praying the same desperate prayers, still seeking the same God who had been his only comfort in the pigsty. When Peter arrived in Ravenna, Archbishop Enrico initially refused to see him. The archbishop was surrounded by supporters who advised him to stand firm, to reject papal interference, to assert Ravenna's ancient dignity and independence. But Peter was not so easily dismissed. He took up residence in a monastery within the city and began to preach, not in cathedral, where he had no permission, but in the streets, in smaller churches, wherever people would gather to hear him. His message was simple but devastating. He spoke of the unity of the church, how Christ had prayed that his followers might be one as he and the Father were one. He described the chaos and bloodshed that would follow if every archbishop decided to go his own way, if every city became its own ecclesiastical kingdom. He reminded them that Ravenna's glory came not from independence, but from its fidelity to the apostolic tradition, the chain of authority stretching back to Peter, the rock on whom Christ built his church. But he also spoke of mercy. He did not condemn Archbishop Enrico as he had condemned so many corrupt prelates over the years. Instead, he acknowledged the legitimate grievances that had led to the dispute, the real ways in which Rome had sometimes overreached or been insensitive to local concerns. He proposed a compromise that would preserve both papal authority and Ravenna's dignity. He was not there to win but to reconcile, not to defeat but to heal. The people of Ravenna listened, and slowly, public opinion began to shift. They remembered Peter. Some of the older ones might even have known him as a child. Here was one of their own, a man who had risen from the lowest depths to the highest honors, and he was pleading with them to preserve unity. Archbishop Enrico found his support crumbling. His advisors began to waver. The question was no longer whether to negotiate, but on what terms. Finally, Enrico agreed to meet with Peter privately. What was said in that meeting? We do not know. Peter never recorded it, and Enrico kept his own counsel. But it must have been extraordinary. Here were two strong-willed men, both convinced of their positions, both proud in their own ways. Peter, however, had a secret weapon. He had nothing left to lose. He was an old man who wanted only to die in his cell. He had no ambition, no agenda beyond the unity of the church. His sincerity was absolute, and Enrico, whatever his faults, could recognize it. The meeting lasted hours. When they emerged, both men were exhausted but at peace. Enrico agreed to submit to papal authority, and withdraw his threats of schism. Peter agreed to carry Enrico's concerns back to Roman advocate for reforms in how the papacy dealt with Ravenna. It was not a complete victory for either side, but it was enough. The schism was averted. The church remained one. Peter should have been triumphant. He had accomplished what he came to do, had prevented a catastrophe through sheer force of moral authority and diplomatic skill. But instead of triumph, he felt only a profound weariness. The effort had drained something essential from him. His companions noticed that he seemed different after meeting with Enrico, grayer, frilier, as if he had given away more than just words in that room. Nevertheless, there was one more task to complete before returning to Font Avellana. Peter decided to visit the monastery of Santa Maria in Porto, just outside Ravenna. This was a monastery he had helped reform years earlier, and he wanted to see how it was faring, to ensure that the discipline he had established was being maintained. It was only a few miles from the city, an easy journey even for an old man. But Peter never made it back from Santa Maria in Porto. On the night of February 22nd, 1073, he fell suddenly and violently ill. The symptoms came on with terrifying speed, fever, severe pain, difficulty breathing. His companions rushed his side, sent for physicians, but everyone who saw him knew immediately that this was a death illness. Peter himself knew it with calm certainty. He asked for a priest, made his confession, received the last sacraments. Then he did something characteristic. He insisted on being laid on the bare ground, covered only with ashes, in imitation of the ancient penitents. His brothers protested. He was a cardinal, a saint. He deserved dignity even in death. But Peter was adamant. "I am a sinner," he said. "Let me die as a sinner should." And so they laid him on the floor, this man who had terrified corrupt bishops and counseled popes, who had experienced mystical visions and written works that would be read for centuries, and he lay there like the humblest penitent, like the ragged child in the pigsty so many years before. As death approached, Peter's mind remained clear. He prayed continuously, reciting the Psalms from memory, the words flowing from him as naturally as breath. Those gathered around him reported that his face seemed to shine with an inner light, that the room filled with a sweetness they could not explain. Several claimed to see the Virgin Mary standing beside him, though others saw nothing. Whether vision or imagination, Peter seemed to see something beyond the veil, and whatever was brought him profound peace. In the early morning hours of February 23rd, 1073, Peter Damian died. His last words, whispered so softly that only those closest could hear, were from the Psalms. "Into your hands I commend my spirit." Then he breathed out once, slowly, and was still. The news of his death spread like wildfire through Ravenna and beyond. People who had heard him preach just days before wept openly. Monks from his hermitages came down from the mountains to pay their respects. Even Archbishop Enrico, the man whose stubbornness had occasioned Peter's final journey, stood vigil beside the body, tears streaming down his face. They had nearly torn the church apart, but this saint had held them together, and now he was gone. Peter's body was taken to Santa Maria in Porto for burial. Immediately, people began reporting miracles at his tomb, the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, the possessed freed from demons. Within years, he was being venerated as a saint, though official canonization would not come until 1828. In 1828, Pope Leo XII not only canonized him, but declared him a doctor of the Church, one of the elite group of saints whose theological and spiritual writings are considered authoritative guides for all Christians. The boy from the pigsty had become a pillar of the Church. The ragged orphan who slept with swine was now honored by popes and theologians. The hermit who wanted only solitude had reformed an institution, shaped an era, and left writings that would inspire reformers and mystics for 1,000 years. Peter Damian had lived every moment of his 72 years with fierce intensity, holding nothing back. spending himself utterly in God's service. And in the end, he died as he had lived, on the ground, covered in ashes, stripped of everything but the love that had driven him from the pigsty to the hermitage to the courts of popes and back again. A love that began as a child's desperate prayer and ended as a saint's quiet offering. Into your hands I commend my spirit. The circle was complete. The journey was finished. Peter Damian had come home at last.